When someone who once showed interest suddenly pulls away, the silence can feel deafening. That text left unanswered, the call that goes to voicemail, the coffee invitation met with a vague, maybe later. What we often mistake as rejection is actually a profound psychological mirror, one that Carl Jung would recognize as an invitation to deeper understanding, not just of them, but of ourselves. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves, Jung wrote. But what about when others don't irritate us, but instead seem not to see us at all? Consider Michael, a software developer from Boston, who spent months building what he thought was a meaningful connection with a colleague. Their conversations flowed effortlessly during lunch breaks, until suddenly they didn't. It was like hitting a wall, he recalled. One day we're talking about our families, and the next, I'm getting one-word responses. Michael's first instinct was to assume he'd done something wrong. Then he wondered if his colleague was dealing with personal issues. Both explanations kept the focus external, anywhere but on Michael's own patterns and expectations. What Jung might suggest is more challenging, that this experience of being ignored was activating something from Michael's unconscious, what Jung called the shadow, the fire. Shadow contains those parts of ourselves we've pushed away, denied, or never fully developed. When someone pulls away from us, it often triggers ancient wounds of abandonment or inadequacy that have been buried in this shadow realm. Ask yourself, does being ignored feel familiar? Is this an old pattern playing out again? Was there a time in your childhood when your needs for attention and recognition went unmet? For many Americans raised in achievement-oriented households, worth became tied to performance and recognition. When someone withdraws attention, it can activate those early questions. Am I not good enough? What did I do wrong? How can I fix this? Jung would encourage us to see this moment of disconnection not as a dead end, but as a crossroads. The pain of being ignored becomes an entrance point to your own unconscious, a chance to examine what this trigger reveals about your own needs, attachments, and unresolved wounds. A survey conducted across major US cities found that 78% of adults report experiencing significant emotional distress when ignored by someone they care about. Yet fewer than 30% ever use that distress as a catalyst for self-reflection. When someone withdraws, our ego rushes to protect us with stories. They're busy, they're rude, they're intimidated by me. These narratives keep us comfortable but stuck. Jung called this projection, attributing our own unconscious content to others rather than owning it ourselves. What if their distance has nothing to do with rejection? What if instead it's revealing something essential about your relationship to yourself? Sarah, a teacher from Chicago, described how being repeatedly ignored by a close friend led her to an unexpected discovery. I realized I'd been ignoring myself for years. I'd push away my own needs, then expect others to somehow magically fulfill them. When my friend pulled back, it forced me to stop outsourcing my emotional well-being. This doesn't mean dismissing genuine mistreatment. Jung never suggested we rationalize away harmful behavior. Rather, he invited us to use these painful moments as opportunities to distinguish between genuine external rejection and our own internal wounds being activated. Consider these questions. How much of your identity is wrapped up in this person's attention? What part of yourself feels diminished when they don't respond? What would it mean to give yourself the recognition you're seeking from them? The irony Jung might point to is that often when we stop demanding others see us, when we truly begin to see ourselves, our relationships transform. Not because others suddenly change their behavior, but because we no longer approach them with the same unconscious hunger for validation. What we interpret as being ignored often speaks a deeper symbolic language, one that Jung spent his life deciphering. In his extensive work with patients, Jung observed that human behavior rarely means only what it appears to mean on the surface. There are depths beneath depths, particularly in our patterns of connection and disconnection. When someone pulls away, we're witnessing what Jung might call a constellation of archetypes, ancient, universal patterns that organize our experiences and behaviors in recognizable ways. The person withdrawing may be embodying the hermit archetype, seeking solitude for integration. You might be experiencing the abandoned child or the rejected lover. These aren't just poetic descriptions, but powerful psychological forces shaping how we interpret and respond to each other. Consider the case of Elizabeth, a marketing executive from Seattle. After 3 months of dating someone who seemed perfectly aligned with her values and interests, communication suddenly became sporadic, then stopped altogether. "I was devastated," she shared. "I kept checking my phone, analyzing our last conversation, wondering what I'd done wrong." In Jungian terms, Elizabeth wasn't just experiencing practical disappointment. She was encountering what Jung called the animus, the unconscious masculine element within a woman's psyche that influences how she relates to men and to her own inner authority. Her particular animus pattern included an expectation of abandonment that dated back to her relationship with her father. "Working with a therapist helped me see that I wasn't just reacting to this one guy," Elizabeth explained. "I was reliving a pattern where I expected men to disappear and then created situations that fulfilled that expectation. I'd choose emotionally unavailable partners, then become hypervigilant about any sign they were pulling away, which paradoxically pushed them away faster." This insight reflects Jung's concept of individuation, the lifelong process of integrating the conscious with the unconscious, leading to wholeness. Elizabeth's painful experience became a gateway to greater self-knowledge and eventually healthier relationships built on genuine connection rather than unconscious compensation. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. When someone ignores us, it often feels like fate, something happening to us beyond our control. But what if their withdrawal is actually an invitation to examine the unconscious patterns directing our relationship choices?" Mark, a dentist from Phoenix, described a friendship that followed a predictable cycle. Intense connection followed by periods of distance. "I'd get so angry when he'd go silent," Mark recalled. "But eventually, I realized something important. I was drawn to this friendship precisely because of this pattern. The drama of reconnection gave me highs that steadier friendships didn't provide." This recognition aligns with Jung's understanding of the unconscious as compensatory, often seeking experiences that balance what's missing in our conscious awareness. If you grew up in an environment where attention was inconsistent, you might unconsciously recreate that familiar rhythm in adult relationships, even as your conscious mind craves stability. The person ignoring you may indeed be acting out their own unresolved patterns. They might be enacting the avoidant archetype, retreating when intimacy becomes threatening, or perhaps they're trapped in the perfectionist, withdrawing when they fear disappointing you. But Jung would gently redirect our focus. What matters most is not their pattern, but our response to it. This redirected focus is what distinguishes Jung's approach from more behavioral or cognitive theories. He wasn't primarily interested in changing outward behaviors, but in understanding the soul's journey toward wholeness, which often involves periods of painful separation and reunion. "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances," Jung observed. "If there is any reaction, both are transformed. When someone pulls away and we feel the sting of that withdrawal, a chemical reaction is indeed taking place, one that can transform both parties if approached with consciousness. In American culture particularly, with its emphasis on positive thinking and quick solutions, there's often pressure to get over feelings of rejection rapidly. Social media compounds this, creating the illusion that everyone else is constantly connected, engaged, and validated. Against this backdrop, being ignored can feel not just painful, but somehow shameful. Jung would challenge this perspective. The experience of withdrawal, either being withdrawn from or feeling the urge to withdraw, contains valuable wisdom about our psychological needs and boundaries. Sometimes being ignored is indeed a message, not about your worth, but about the natural rhythms of human connection that require both engagement and space. Consider the wisdom in these words from Jung. "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." Being ignored is something that happens to you. How you metabolize that experience, the meaning you make of it, the aspects of yourself you discover through it, represents who you are becoming. This process involves what Jung called active imagination, a method of engaging with unconscious material through creative exploration. Rather than simply ruminating on being ignored, you might ask yourself, if this experience were a dream, what would it be trying to tell me? If it were a character in a story, what would its purpose be? What is trying to emerge in me through this painful experience? Dr. Rebecca Thornton, a Jungian analyst in Austin, notes, Americans often approach relationships with a consumer mindset. If it's not delivering consistent satisfaction, something must be wrong. But meaningful relationships aren't products. They're living processes with natural cycles of connection and separation. When someone pulls away, it may be part of this natural rhythm rather than a rejection. It might reflect their need for introspection, their struggle with intimacy, or simply the ebb and flow of their own energy. What's most important is how we use this space, not to obsess over their absence, but to discover what it illuminates about our own inner landscape. The true meaning behind someone ignoring you often has less to do with their conscious intentions and more to do with the unconscious dialogue happening between your deeper selves, the parts that Jung would say are seeking wholeness, even when that journey involves pain. The most profound insights often emerge not from connection, but from its absence. When someone ignores us, we stand at the threshold of what Jung considered essential territory for psychological growth, the confrontation with the shadow and the potential for genuine transformation. In Jungian psychology, the shadow isn't simply negative aspects of personality. It's all that remains unconscious or undeveloped within us, including unrealized potential, creativity, and authentic power. When relationships falter through withdrawal or indifference, we're often encountering our shadow material in its most potent form. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, Jung wrote, but by making the darkness conscious. This darkness isn't moral failure or deficiency, but rather those aspects of self that haven't yet been integrated into conscious awareness. Being ignored creates a particular kind of darkness, a void where connection once existed that can illuminate parts of ourselves we've never fully examined. Dr. James Hollis, a prominent Jungian analyst practicing in Washington, D.C., observes that what we most need is often found where we least want to look. For many, the experience of being ignored creates precisely this unwanted territory, a psychological space we resist entering because it activates our deepest vulnerabilities. Consider the experience of David, an architect from Denver, whose long-term partner began withdrawing emotionally after several years together. "At first, I did everything to get his attention back," David recalled. "I became the perfect partner, attentive, accommodating, never expressing negative emotions, but the distance only grew." Through therapy, David realized he was repeating a childhood pattern. Growing up with a mother who withdrew affection when displeased, he'd learned to suppress his authentic needs and feelings to maintain connection. His partner's withdrawal was activating this old wound, but also offering a pathway to healing it. "I had to face something terrifying," David said. "The possibility that if I showed up authentically, with boundaries, preferences, and occasionally difficult emotions, I might lose the relationship entirely, but I was already losing it by being inauthentic." This confrontation represents what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, the psychological maturity to contain seemingly contradictory truths without prematurely resolving them. In David's case, both loving his partner and acknowledging the relationship's limitations, both desiring connection and honoring his need for authenticity, both fearing abandonment and being willing to risk it for something more genuine. Throughout America's cultural landscape, from self-help books to Hollywood romances, we're often sold simplistic narratives about relationships. Find the right person, communicate effectively, and lasting connection is guaranteed. Jung's perspective is both more challenging and more liberating. Relationships aren't puzzles to solve, but mysteries to experience, containers for our ongoing individuation. When someone ignores you, Jung might suggest asking not, "How do I fix this?" but rather, "What is trying to be born through this experience?" The withdrawal creates space, painful space certainly, but space nonetheless for new aspects of self to emerge. Jessica, a professor from Minneapolis, described how being repeatedly ignored by a close colleague led to an unexpected breakthrough. "I realized I'd spent my entire career seeking external validation. Being ignored forced me to develop an internal sense of value that wasn't dependent on others' recognition." This shift represents what Jung called the movement from an external to an internal locus of control, a crucial aspect of individuation. When our sense of worth and meaning comes primarily from within, others' withdrawal no longer carries the same devastating power. The transformative potential in these experiences connects to Jung's concept of the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to create a third option beyond simple opposites. When ignored, we typically oscillate between two responses: anxious pursuit or angry withdrawal. The transcendent function offers another possibility, using the experience as a catalyst for deeper self-understanding and authentic growth. The most terrifying thing, Jung wrote, is to accept oneself completely. Being ignored often brings us face to face with aspects of ourselves we'd prefer not to see. Our dependency, our abandonment fears, our tendency to compromise authenticity for approval. The invitation isn't to judge these qualities, but to integrate them consciously, understanding their origins and transforming their expression. Rachel, a nurse from Nashville, shared how a friendship's sudden dissolution led to a powerful realization. I'd been ignoring myself for years before my friend ever ignored me. I'd pushed away my own interests, intuitions, and needs to maintain connections. When she pulled away despite all my efforts, something broke open in me. I saw how I'd been betraying myself. This profound insight reflects another Jungian principle: projection recall. We often project disowned aspects of ourselves onto others, then react strongly when those others fail to carry our projections. When someone ignores us, they may be refusing, consciously or not, to carry our projected needs, forcing us to reclaim responsibility for our emotional well-being. In American culture, with its emphasis on independence and self-reliance, acknowledging emotional dependency can feel shameful. Jung would argue that this cultural attitude creates a particular kind of shadow, the denied vulnerability that then emerges in unconscious ways, often through relationships where we become inexplicably attached to people who are emotionally unavailable. The healing path involves what Jung called the circumambulation of the self, a gradual circling and integration of all aspects of psyche, including those parts activated by rejection. This isn't a linear process, but a spiral one, where we revisit similar wounds at deeper levels throughout life. Dr. Clarissa Pinkola Estes, Jungian analyst and author of Women Who Run with the Wolves, describes this process as composting psychological material, allowing painful experiences to break down and become fertile ground for new growth. Being ignored in this framework becomes compost for deepening self-knowledge and authentic relationship capacity. Consider these questions for reflection. What if the person ignoring you is actually serving as a psychopomp, a guide to underworld territories within yourself that need exploration? What disowned needs or feelings might their withdrawal be highlighting? What aspects of yourself have you been ignoring that now demand attention? Thomas, a writer from Portland, described a transformative insight after being ghosted by someone. He'd been dating. I realized I'd been using romantic connections to avoid a deeper relationship with myself and my creative work. Their disappearance created space I initially filled with anxiety, but eventually filled with writing. The relationship ending was painful, but catalyzed the book I'd been avoiding writing for years. This exemplifies Jung's understanding that neurosis, the suffering that comes from psychological fragmentation, contains the seeds of its own healing. The very pain that destabilizes us also points toward what needs integration for greater wholeness. For those currently experiencing the pain of being ignored, Jung would likely offer both compassion and challenge. Compassion for the genuine suffering this creates, particularly when it activates early attachment wounds, and challenge to use this suffering as an initiation into greater psychological maturity. There is no coming to consciousness without pain, Jung observed. The particular pain of disconnection, of being ignored by someone whose attention matters to us, can serve as a powerful doorway to consciousness if we're willing to walk through it. Emily, a software engineer from Chicago, shared how a mentor's sudden withdrawal forced a critical reevaluation. I'd been measuring my professional worth entirely through his approval. When that approval disappeared, I had to develop my own professional compass. It was excruciating at first, but ultimately liberating. This liberation represents the essence of Jungian individuation, the ongoing process of becoming more fully ourselves, integrating both conscious and unconscious aspects into coherent, authentic whole. Being ignored often accelerates this process by removing external validation and forcing internal development. In the symbolic language of archetypes, this transformation might be understood as the death of the dependent child archetype and the birth of the inner sovereign, that aspect of self capable of self-validation and clear-eyed discernment about relationships. Not coincidentally, this shift often attracts connections that are themselves more mature and authentic. The privilege of a lifetime, Jung wrote, is to become who you truly are. When someone ignores you, they may be unknowingly offering this privilege, the opportunity to disentangle your sense of self from external validation and to claim the authority of your own experience. This doesn't mean ignoring genuine needs for connection and recognition. Humans are inherently relational beings, and healthy interdependence remains essential for well-being. What changes through this process is the quality of that interdependence, from unconscious reenactment of old wounds to conscious participation in relationships that foster mutual growth. The ultimate meaning behind someone ignoring you may be found not in their intentions or actions, but in your response to this catalyst. Will you use it as an opportunity for deeper self-knowledge? Will you allow it to reveal patterns that no longer serve you? Will you let it guide you toward more authentic ways of relating, both to yourself and others? As Jung reminded us, the shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. There is no universal prescription for handling the experience of being ignored. What matters is developing the psychological flexibility to learn from this experience in ways that advance your unique journey toward wholeness. The pain of disconnection thus becomes not just something to endure or overcome, but a necessary catalyst in the alchemy of becoming. Through this lens, being ignored transforms from simple rejection into a complex invitation to greater self-knowledge, authentic expression, and ultimately to relationships founded on mutual recognition rather than unconscious need.